So I'm going to have a very brief chat to you about a trial that we hope to begin very soon, which was in response to a commissioning brief put out by the NIHR Health Technology Assessment Programme in 2015. And so I'm going to begin with a bit of background, and then I'm going to tell you something about what happened during the course of the application process, and then tell you something about the grant, the project itself. So let's start with a question. I'd like to hear your view. Do you think there's a genuine clinical decision problem regarding how best to use antifungal drugs among ICU patients? Vote 1 for yes, vote 2 for no. Is it a problem, or is there no big deal? That's good, because that means I don't have to spend very long persuading you that we actually needed a study in the first place. Okay, so I'm going to start by briefly summarising why there is a problem in ICU. And I'm going to start with another HTA-funded trial that happened about 10 years ago. And this was carried out by ICNARC and led by David Harrison there. And it was all about developing a predictive model to identify ICU patients at high risk of invasive fungal infection who might benefit from prophylaxis. I'm not particularly interested in this study for that reason. I'm interested in it because it was huge. It looked at 61,000 ICU admissions across 96 UK ICUs. So we've got a huge amount of data about infection and antifungal use in our ICU population. And here's the nugget. There were only 6 invasive fungal infections per 1,000 admissions in that cohort. And only half of those acquired their infection while in ICU. So in fact, fungal infection in ICU seems to be a relatively uncommon event. What's a much less uncommon event is antifungal drug prescription. 7% of ICU patients receive an antifungal drug, and that equates to around 11,000 patients each year in the UK. And so here's another important nugget from the FIRE study. Of patients receiving an antifungal drug that was started in ICU, only 1 in 20 had a proven fungal infection. Now, of course, that might be in part because we didn't diagnose fungal infection terribly well and missed some of them, but 1 in 20 sounds like quite a dramatic ratio. So, I've been battering away at antifungal diagnostics and stewardship in ICU for many years, and I've been trying to get a study funded from various funders without success for many years. So, when 4 years ago the NIHR programme put out a themed call for antimicrobial resistance, I thought, this is my opportunity. So at that time, I drafted a study design for a randomised trial of an antifungal stewardship intervention. And it is as you might expect. I thought, well, if we could identify patients who had suspected infection but the cause was unknown, many of those will not have fungal infection, but if we randomise them to standard care or a rapid test to guide antifungal prescribing, we could then measure some important outcomes and compare them between the two groups, like antifungal drug use, diagnostic accuracy of the rapid test we used, and cost effectiveness of a rapid test in this setting. So this is what I came 4 years ago to NIHR with by way of proposal. So now I'd like to ask you another question. If you were going to do a study like this, what rapid test would you choose as your antifungal stewardship intervention? Would you choose beta-glucan? Would you choose Candida albicans germ tube antibody? Would you do a PCR test? Would you do a Manan or anti-Manan test? Or would you do none? Do you think it's all nonsense? An interesting spread, but it's fair to say that beta-glucan and PCR between them are pretty popular choices. Great. So, I might just take a moment to tell you something about the different types of funding pathway in the NIHR Health Technology Assessment Programme. For years, the commonest route to funding was researcher-led. In other words, you had an idea, you put in an expression of interest application form, and that was scrutinised at several levels. And the first level of scrutiny was, does this topic look to be of interest does it seem to be something that's important to the NHS? And quite a lot of applications get filtered out at that stage, because you're competing with things like dementia and obesity and diabetes and mental health, and it's quite difficult for something like mycology to find its space. A slightly less difficult process is a themed call. Whenever the programme says, well, we're interested in antimicrobial resistance, so we look favourably on AMR-related applications. And an even more desirable strategy is to apply for a commissioned call when the programme has said, this research question is one that we want researchers in the UK to find the answer to for us. So there are 3 different levels. This is the one in the middle from about 4 years ago that I put in the application for the trial that I've just shown you. So a themed call is an invitation for research on a given topic, and it feels like an open door. But an open door is, of course, all about perspective, because in my experience, that was very quickly turned around and looked quite different from the other perspective. Because what happened in the course of that application was I got rejected at the outline stage. And this was a funny kind of experience. It was very informative, because I learned a lot about the process in the course of being part of it, because I got some feedback, and also because I managed to find my way onto the funding board that was making these awards. That was informative, but I have to tell you, as you might expect, whenever your grant is being discussed, you have to leave the room. Any perceived conflict of interest means you leave the room, they talk about your grant, then you come back into the room. And if you ever find yourself in that situation, I can tell you that when you come back into the room, and people are all looking down, shuffling papers, no eye contact, they'll not tell you what the outcome was, but you know the outcome. So that was my experience of sitting around the table and being rejected. The feedback I got wasn't all that illuminating, and it can be difficult sometimes to interpret feedback. The board thought it was an important issue. They thought the choice of antifungal agent as a primary outcome measure in a study was problematic. And this was difficult for me, because antimicrobial stewardship will often rely on using antimicrobial use as a primary outcome. There was something about behavioural bias that I didn't really understand. There was something about patient and public involvement being weak, and to be fair, that's a very important part of the NIHR's approach to research. But this was the real signal. The board was unclear of how the study would provide overall benefit to the NHS. And this is the thing that I now understand that I didn't then understand. Because NIHR funding boards, by and large, are constructed with people who are experts in research, but they know very, very little about the clinical or scientific details of many of the projects they're looking at. So our job is not to give them a whole bunch of detail that they've got to work through. Our job as applicants is to give them a sales pitch that is big picture, a sales pitch that says, this is what this project will do for patients. And that's easy to miss, and I think we do that, but we often get sucked into the small detail as we write these grants. So I spent quite a long period in the dark after that rejection, because of course every time you spend a lot of effort writing a grant and then it gets kicked out, you're wounded, you've got to go to the corner and lick your wounds and recover for a while. But luckily, while I was recovering, the NIHR guys were, to be fair, paddling like fury underneath the surface, and they were taking the concept of antifungal stewardship and working it up into something that they thought fitted their needs better. And the main message that I derived from that was that I was putting forward a randomized trial of a stewardship intervention that was based on a rapid test. But the HTA's perspective was, do you really think we know enough about the accuracy of rapid tests to go straight to a randomized trial? And that led to them developing a commissioning brief. In 2015, this was advertised. And this is what a HTA commissioning brief looks like. The research question was, in patients treated for suspected fungal infection, can rapid tests be used to rule out infection and guide early discontinuation of treatment? So there are a number of things about this kind of brief that are quite important. The program will specify quite a bit about what they want you to do. Like they've said, the technology will be rapid tests. Don't come up with a risk score, that's not where we're at this time. They'll tell you something about the patient group they want. And in this case, they wanted people who were started on an antifungal drug. They'll tell you something about the clinical setting, which I'll come back to. They acknowledge that we need a reference standard, but they didn't specify much about that because they know that reference standards in medical mycology are very difficult. And that they tell you the study design and important outcomes they want. The setting is a difficult thing because, as you can see there, the inpatient settings include adult and pediatric ICUs and hemato-oncology units. And this was the first major problem because people in this room know that in ICU the main problem is Candida infection. In hem-onc the main problem is Aspergillus. Different diseases, different prevalences, different tests, often different treatments. So putting all of these together in a single study is probably not a great idea. And the challenge there is, although you can go back to the funders and say, we think you've got this wrong because X, Y, and Z, that's a really risky thing to do because they don't start with the position that they think they've got it wrong. So in fact, Samir and I had a phone call about this on a couple of occasions, and we discussed the possibility of combining an ICU and a hem-onc bid, but we concluded that just because the brief was not good, that was not a reason to write a research proposal that was not good. And so actually I ended up writing an ICU proposal that stood alone. And to do that, I assembled a team, and you might be surprised to discover that on the team were 3 microbiologists. I was one. You'll know Lewis. Many of you will know Lewis, a clinical scientist in Cardiff, and some of you might know Tanya, who I work with in Belfast. I had a bunch of intensivist mates, one of whom is a paediatric intensivist. The other guys are pretty well-known players nationally in ICU research. And reflecting the fact that funding boards are full of trials methodologists, my team is full of trials methodologists. These people are mostly statisticians and study design experts. Of course, you need someone who understands health economics, and we've got that. And we've got really good PPI representation from a guy who has done this quite a bit. As well as that, we're well supported by a clinical trials unit, ICNARC, and the Newcastle Diagnostic Evidence Cooperative. So it's quite a diverse group of people who have pulled together to make this application look like something that's fundable. And this is the outline of what our proposal looks like. Essentially, the entry point is adults and children in ICU started presumptively on antifungal treatment. 30 ICUs is the sort of size of the project we need to get 1,500 patients. And the key thing is that on all of these patients, we will categorize their fungal status based on the reference standard and the index tests. A small minority of people we expect to have an actual fungal infection. The majority won't have anything. And then we'll compare the performance of the index tests in comparison to the reference standard by drawing a 2x2 table and coming up with sensitivity, specificity, and all that. So, which index tests did we choose? Well, our thinking was very similar to your thinking. We started off looking at a systematic review of beta-glucan, and of course, we have concluded that across a large number of studies in invasive candidiasis, the sensitivity of beta-glucan is pretty good. We also favour PCR, again in a meta-analysis, which is difficult to interpret because obviously this is a meta-analysis of lots of different PCR methodologies, different gene targets, etc. But essentially the recurring message is sensitivity of PCR seems to be pretty good. And possibly better than beta-glucan, but here's the thing, we're not limited to one test. So we can come up with a single test or a combination. I think the key message that I took from my experience of being on the HTA board is they're really keen on investigating technologies that are ready for introduction. So that's probably not an in-house test that you've got in your garage. It's probably a commercial test that's ready for rollout in a standardized way. So we plan to study a commercial beta-glucan assay from Associates. We plan to study a commercial PCR assay from T2 and another from Renishaw, which is now Bruker. We considered multi-pathogen detection tests that are used for sepsis, such as Iridica and Septifast, but we concluded that these were quite expensive and are likely to mess up the health economics of testing. And so we've shelved that for now at least, although that's something that we might come back to. You all know that it's difficult to classify patients accurately in terms of fungal infection. In other words, the reference standard is imperfect. And luckily, HTA have published in their journal about 10 years ago some guidance about what to do when there's no perfect reference standard. And there are lots of things you can do, which we don't really have time to talk about, but essentially the solution depends on the problem. And for mycology, the best solution is probably to use a constructed reference standard that's a composite of lots of measures. And you know, you're very familiar with this because the EORTC disease definitions are exactly that kind of reference standard, a composite of lots of things. We plan to strengthen this a bit by having a panel consensus review of patients to make sure that clinical judgment is broadly in line with the composite reference standard that we're using. And so what are we going to do? Are we going to use proven infection? Are we going to use probable infection? Well, we've decided that we'll have two analyses. The main analysis will be proven invasive candidiasis, and for that we can use the EORTC definition, because although written for cancer, proven infection, the definition for proven infection is easily translatable to non-cancer patients. For our secondary analysis, we plan to use proven plus probable, on the basis that our proven group won't capture all people who probably have invasive candidiasis. However, for probable, we can't use the EORTC definition because that doesn't extend to people who don't have cancer. Luckily, quite a bit of work is going on at the minute, and Peter is leading a piece of work that will hopefully lead to some definitions outside of the traditional cancer patient group, and one of those groups is ICU, and I hope that by the time we start into this study, there'll be a definition of probable fungal disease written for the ICU population that we might be able to use, and that will be really good. If there isn't, we'll have to make one up. We've had quite a lot of fun with picking a sample size for our study, and so I think I'm short of time, so I'm not going to actually go on to the next question. I was going to ask you a question about what you think we should do about picking a sample size, because actually quite a few diagnostic accuracy studies just get done based on the largest achievable number that the investigators could study, rather than a formal sample size calculation. So we used some background measures to guide what sample size we needed, and we also did a survey of ICU doctors and said, what sensitivity would you need to persuade you to stop an antifungal drug based on a lab test? And you can see there that 90 to 95% is where most of the action is. We expect our point estimate of sensitivity to be 95%, and therefore we've said, well, we'd like the lower bound of the confidence interval that gets put across that point estimate to be no lower than 90, so that way we'll capture these people. And that means that we can't have a lower bound of 95% because that would require an infinite number of patients, and so we decided we needed 1,500. So after we got through the outline stage of the grant application, we wrote a very long full application. And after we wrote a very long full application, we got some reviewer comments, and we responded to these, and then the board looked at our response to these, and they wrote back with a fairly favourable response, and what they call a fund with changes response. So this effectively means we have a few suggestions for you. If you play the game and follow these suggestions, you'll probably get the money. And so one of those suggestions was a sample size query. And I think we got this because the deputy chair of this funding board is a man called John Deeks, who is an international expert genius in diagnostic accuracy studies, and he understands this stuff much better than many of us. And he said, you Muppets, The proposed sample size has been computed ignoring several sources of uncertainty and using inappropriate approximations. To have 90% power, and this is an important point, 90% power. Who powers a diagnostic accuracy study? Well, most of us don't, but evidently we need to. To have 90% power to do the thing that you said you wanted to do, you actually need 221 people with infection. And that means you would need to study 4,800 people, and in fact, for a little bit of data loss, etc., that means you need 5,000 patients. Remember, we had planned to study 1,500 patients. So this was a torpedo. This was something that we looked at and thought, surely this is not a simple tweak. We need a whole new strategy here, or else we can't get this funded, because it's just not possible to add £2 million to the cost of a trial. Our strategy then became to refocus our sample size. Instead of thinking about sensitivity and the lower bound of the confidence interval, we picked up on something that Tom mentioned earlier. We used the negative predictive value, and we said, look, intensive care doctors told us in our survey that they really want to know, and they really want to see a negative predictive value of more than 98%. So we said, we will aim for a negative predictive value of 99%, and to do that, we actually need not 1,500, but 1,720. Let's be honest, this is the art of the possible rather than perfect, because it may be preferable to have done what the funding board said and study 5,000 patients, but we don't have 10 years to do this research. So 1720 was a way around it, which means we need fewer cases of fungal infection, which means we'll still come up with a similar sensitivity estimate, but just with a very slightly wider confidence interval. And we'll be able to study the slightly inflated number of patients by increasing our number of study sites from 30 to 35. So that's a very brief summary of the study. It tells you something about how we got here. I hope I've persuaded you that getting here has been a fairly long and winding road over the past 4 or 5 years. But the sad truth is that I know, however long and winding that road has been, the next 5 years is going to be a much, much worse road for me. And there's now a red light flashing under my nose, so on that bombshell, I will thank you for your attention.